Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Missouri Review's Zoom space. I'm Bailey Boyd, contest editor at the Missouri Review, and I am so excited to be able to speak with Thomas Dodson, fiction winner of the 2020 Jeffrey E. Smith Editors Prize in Fiction for his story, Keeping. You can find Dodson's story in the spring 2021 issue, and you can also find the story on our website, where it also appeared as part of our featured prose series. And the link to that will be in the description below. Dodson has generously agreed to read an excerpt from his winning story, which is such a striking piece of humanity, vulnerability, sexuality, and friendship, all told within the context of beekeeping. After his reading, Dodson is going to talk with us just a little bit more about his work. Thomas Dodson is a librarian and assistant professor at Southern Oregon University in Ashland, Oregon. His fiction has appeared in Gulf Coast, Chicago Quarterly Review, Beloit Fiction Journal, and elsewhere. Founding editor of Printer's Devil Review, he was also the executive editor of the Best Indie Lit New England series. He is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, where he was an Iowa Arts Fellow. And now I would love to introduce Thomas Dodson and his story, Keeping.
Thanks, Bailey. So I'm going to read from a little bit from the very beginning. Keeping. It was a humbling thing, asking for help like this, needing it so badly. But removing his hat, brushing flakes of snow from brim and crown, Guy knew there was no other way. His neighbor's fields, already stripped of corn and soybeans, would soon be a single plain of snow, patches of winter rye, the only green for acres. Cold winds would blow freely across all that flatness, gathering strength until they reached the stand of pines at the edge of his apiary. The trees would provide a break, and he could wrap the hives in tar paper to keep out the frost, but it wouldn't be enough. His bees, what was left of them, they wouldn't survive an Iowa winter. He needed to take them west. He'd been standing on the porch of Taylor's place, weighed down with what he meant to ask, when he heard the baby crying. It wailed and wailed, a helpless thing, full to the top with need. When it finally hushed, he opened the screen and knocked. Taylor's wife answered. She had the baby with her, his head covered in wisps of fine brown hair, face pressed to her breast, sucking away. Guy coughed and looked down at his shoes. Come in, Andrea said, unconcerned. Taylor's out back, finishing up. He followed her inside, ducking to avoid the transom. 40-odd years lifting supers filled with honey, each box, heavy as a newborn calf, had stooped his shoulders. But all told, work in the bee yard had done him good. He hadn't dwindled like other men his age, was still broad-backed and tall. He knew to move carefully in these old farmhouses. In the dining room, his eyes were drawn to the glass-windowed cabinet. Built to house pickled beets and bottles of homemade jam, Taylor's wife had stocked it with books, their spines emblazoned with words like feminist, gay and lesbian, queer. He could remember a time when it would have been dangerous to have such books where people could see them. Ain't much difference, his father had said, between a cocksucker and a communist. You're in your Sunday best, Andrea said. Business in town? She lowered herself into a chair and settled the baby on her lap. The bank. Every once in a while, they like to bring you in, turn you upside down, see if anything falls out. She smiled politely. In truth, it was only for this visit that he traded his work boots for Oxford, set aside his overalls, and retrieved his suit from the back of the closet. He'd worn it last 10 years ago at Alma's funeral. The back door clattered shut, and Taylor called from the kitchen. Something got at one of the hives, scat on the ground, and some bees shooed and spat out. In here, Andrea said. Guy stopped by. Oh yeah? Taylor said cheerfully. She strode into the room, wiping her hands on the front of her jeans, the cuffs still tucked into her socks. She placed a hand on Andrea's shoulder, bent down and kissed the baby's head. The chair next to Andrea was stacked with papers. Taylor cleared them and sat down. Should have phoned first, Guy said, shifting in his seat. You're always welcome, you know that. The tips of his ears burning, he looked at his hands. These bouts of bashfulness, they sometimes happened around Taylor. She was just so, he couldn't think of a better word for it, handsome. She reminded him of James Dean in East of Eden, and also vaguely of Milton Law, a high school classmate and the first boy he'd ever kissed. Brought you this. Setting his hat on the table, he retrieved the package from under his arm, a square section of honeycomb in a clear plastic box. He'd selected for his offering a product of his strongest hive. Workers had filled each of the cells with amber honey, sealed them over with the freshest wax. It was a beautiful comb, white-capped and neatly cut, something to be proud of. You didn't have to do that, Andrea said. You know, Taylor keeps trying to win me over to the dark stuff. Her face crinkled and she shook her head from side to side. It's not for me, though. Too funky. I've always been too funky for you, Miranda. Taylor had seeded a portion of her land with buckwheat. Bees that fed on its white-petaled flowers made dark honey, near to black, nutty, and pleasingly bitter. More traditional, Guy kept his meadow stocked with wildflowers, Shasta daisies and black-eyed Susans, clover that bloomed in shades of white, pink, and crimson. His bees rewarded him with a sweet, light honey that he sold to grocery stores, driving in each week to stock the shelves himself. You say you got some critter nosing into a hive? What do you think? Taylor said. A raccoon? Skunk, more likely. You can put up chicken wire. She'll have to stand on her hind legs and the bees can sting her belly. Or you could set a trap. The baby began to fuss again, and Andrea excused herself. She bundled the boy in a sling and carried him away, her flip-flops slapping as she mounted the stairs. Guy sat across from Taylor in silence. Most of the time, it was easy between them. They'd known each other for going on 8 years now, ever since she'd come to the beekeepers' meeting at the VFW hall. She'd had so many questions, was so eager to learn the trade. He'd invited her to join him in his bee yard, a kind of apprenticeship. Later, when he gotten a call from the fire department about a swarm hanging from a picnic table in Happy Hollow Park, they'd gone together to capture it. They'd smoked the bees, doused them with sugar spray, and shook them into one of his spare supers. He'd given her the box and all the bees inside, her first colony. Together, they cleared her backyard, transformed it into an apiary. She ran her own operation now, small but thriving. That was how their friendship worked. Guy offering help and advice, passing on the craft, taking pride in Taylor's success. But this, asking her for help, real help, the kind that involved sacrifice, it felt wrong. Guy, is everything all right? You seem, I don't know, bothered. It's been a hard year, he began. A real hard year. And I'll stop there. I just realized I don't know how to pronounce apiary.
Thank you so much for that. Oh, I loved hearing you read that beginning of the story. I got so into it. As far as the conversation portion of the evening, I think one of the things that folks are wondering about is how this story came to be. So you talk a little bit about your inspiration for the story in your artist statement and in your recent feature about what it was like for you to win the prize. And so I'm just wondering if you could talk more about the process of going from the inspiration all the way to the finished version to the story that we have now.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, for a while, part of I guess the background is I've been interested in, Ashley Shelby has this term for a certain kind of climate change fiction, first impact fiction, which is to say, it's not like, the kind of, a dystopian future. It's kind of, there are little pockets of dystopia everywhere now. And I think most of us realizing that more and more. But for me, there's a kind of broader category, I guess. I'm interested in what people call, the Anthropocene, which is to say, it's a way of, thinking about not just humans have done tons of things other than climate change, obviously, to change the environment. And a lot of people think that the only way to think through that and address it is a point of view that takes a kind of almost a geological time scale point of view. So I was really intrigued by a bunch of those ideas. And so I've been in some of my writing thinking about um, how to write about those things in a kind of personal human way. Um, and so that would include things that we're doing like pesticides killing off bee colonies. And I have another story I'm working on about fracking. And So just kind of, I've been in general interested in writing sort of ecological stories concerned with what uh, what it means to be living at the end of the Holocene and the beginning of the Anthropocene. Um, so there was that kind of general background, and then I heard this story on NPR, maybe more than one, and I read something in National Geographic about these bee heists, and the idea just seemed so strange to me, but that also just made perfect sense. So initially, I thought I would write a story from the point of view of someone who stole the bees. Um, and it's funny, one of the things that you don't that doesn't make it into the text of the story is the character, my imagination of the character who steals the bees. The people who own uh, the the almond groves that the bees that Guy and Taylor's bees are meant to pollinate. Um, they say that of they believe that this person stole the bees, and they say he was a problem, he was trouble. So it never makes it into the story, but I imagine it as like a labor organizer, someone that was perhaps a manual laborer who started trying to get some rights for the people who lived in those fields, or had worked in those fields rather, and the owners didn't like it and sort of made his life very difficult and fired him and stuff. And so he had to, find some way to make some income. So yeah, I guess I'll just say like in that, like I try not to imagine any of the characters in my stories as sort of villains, like he plays the role of an antagonist to some extent, but I never sort of imagined that person as like a villain. Um, so I started from being interested in these bee heists, and I thought I might do it from the point of view of the thieves. Then I realized the stakes would be so high for someone whose entire livelihood, every once a year they pack up their entire farm, essentially all their bees, into the back of a truck and drive it across the country to pollinate fields in California, and lots of commercial beekeepers do that. And also, it was nice because I was living in Iowa, and if I had some of the people who do that are raising bees in Iowa, and they go to California, so it's like a real thing. And then initially, I thought I was going to tell it part from Guy's perspective and part from Taylor's perspective, and I wrote part of a draft that way. But I was in I was lucky to be at Iowa when I was working on it. So I was in a workshop with led by Ethan Kanan, and he was kind of very much sort of like, this is Guy's story. It's one person's story. Why don't you try writing it that way? And that was good advice. It's funny. He also it looked at an early draft and said something that I didn't, some advice I didn't follow. It was good advice I didn't follow. He said, you can't start with like a kind of emotionally wrenching beginning and then end with a gunfight. Like, so this is also the first story I've ever had that has a gun in it. And I'm very conscious of that. And I was like, well, I'm gonna put a gun in it, but like, I don't want to sort of like fetishize it or whatever. So like it's going to be a 22. It's going to be like not, a kind of the Taylor character is not some sort of John Wayne, swaggering around with a big gun. Yeah, so it went through several drafts. I had lots of good advice. Before, in the process of writing the first draft, I just read a lot about beekeeping because I like, I have I obviously from imagination, but I actually like doing research. I'm a librarian, and I love the little details that you can get that are just so particular if you learn about something like beekeeping. So I didn't know any beekeepers, but I read a lot. And so like, I wouldn't have known what color are the beekeeping suits and why does that matter? What does it smell like when the bees release their alarm pheromone, all of those sorts of details. I get really interested in that. And I think that the reason that I think initially I started, as I was thinking through why Guy has this condition that makes it difficult for him to tend his bees, is I wanted to have this kind of element where it was clear that something to do with the way we sort of live now with industrial farms and things like that this is not responsible for what's happening to his bees. Like, it's not just like it's not unrelated to all of that. He mentions at one point that he's seen his neighbors having low-flying planes dropping pesticides, and there's some evidence that that's part of what's a big part of what's going on with bees having dying off and stuff. But the other part of it was, as I was reading about beekeeping, I came to realize that a skilled beekeeper, certainly one who would have the kind of experience that Guy would have, would know how to get around that mostly. Probably still might be able to get by. So for him to have a kind of complete collapse, lose half his bees, something else had to be going on, and it didn't take long before. So okay, what are the kind of what's the bee story? What's the what are the emotional stakes? And it's, well, he's going to have to ask for help, which he doesn't want to do in a relationship that has not worked that way. And also, he feels that he needs to lie, which he's done earlier in his life in his related to his sexuality. So.
Thank you so much for that. It's interesting. I feel like I just got the backstory on so many of the small details that I so admire. So the no one being a villain. That's one of the things I really, really loved about this story. About everybody has that is afforded that humanity here. And then
I hope so. I really hope so. Yeah.
Yeah, and then the small details about the scent that the bees give off. I highlighted that one too. I just thought that was so special. So I'm so glad to hear you, mention all of these things and where they came from.
It's funny. Originally with the smell of the bee pheromone, I in an early draft I compared it to like the smell of banana bread. Basically, I heard it smelled like bananas, but that wasn't quite enough. But then when I moved here, one of my coworkers in my office at the library, it turns out, is a beekeeper, and so and she generously offered to read the story for that, and said, it's more like what a kind of candy maker would think banana smells like. It's kind of more chemical. It smells kind of artificial. I've been doing more drafting even on it since it was published to put it in a collection, and I finally settled on like smells like banana taffy. Like, I think that kind of communicates as kind of something artificial, but with still that kind of the flavor of that fruit.
Oh my gosh, yeah. And banana bread and candied banana is so different. So, oh man.
Yeah. So she set me straight.
That's so fascinating. While we've got you here, is there anything that you can tell us about what you're working on now, or where we can keep an eye out for more of your work coming out in the near future?
Sure. I don't have anything forthcoming, but as the magazines open up in this time of year in the fall, I'm sending out things that I've been working on, and but some things that so there's some stories that are sort of from last summer or whatever that are out now. But the projects I'm actually working on now. So in my new role here, I need to do some scholarly writing. And I thought one of the things that librarians do is there's a couple of publications that inform librarians about what books they want to buy for their collections. And particularly you're a librarian who is associated with, say, the theater collection. You need to know what theater books there are, and you might not have a very, very strong background in theater yourself, so you need a little help. And one of the things you can write for those is a bibliographic essay, which sounds maybe not so exciting, but it's exciting to me because I'm going to be writing for Choice Magazine a bibliographic essay about fiction craft books. So I feel like so much of that is, you get an unannotated list on a piece of paper from your writing instructor as an undergraduate. And these are the books I would have you read. Or, in MFA program, a lot of people are talking about craft in the real world, or whatever. And so you kind of are, if you're in the right place at the right time, you sort of hear word of mouth about those books. But I think most librarians who are associated with English departments that have creative writing programs or creative writing departments don't necessarily have access to that and don't really have that background. So I'm reading, just a big pile of so I'm reading about 70 books. Half of them I've already are, but because I've been doing this for a little while, and so I love reading craft books. I always get a lot out of them, particularly if I'm have sort of writer's blocks or I'm stumped on something. I'll grab a favorite craft book off the shelf. So I'm going to be writing that sort of guide to fiction craft books, and I'm particularly excited about. There's a set of books like I want to make sure I get their names correct. Books by David Murrah, Felicia Rose Chavez, Matthew Salesses, about how so many of our ideas about craft are kind of are really kind of presume a white writer and a white audience and white characters, and that and also how workshops often have some built-in assumptions which may appear neutral but really aren't. So, for example, if you're, Black, Indigenous person of color, in a writing workshop, and everyone else in your workshop is white, and given you're following the kind of Iowa model where you're not supposed to speak, your experience of workshop may be, a group of people who don't have a certain kind of cultural knowledge and don't get your work. And you may not get much out of that. So it may be, make sense to do workshop differently, since it, yeah. So I've been, and just kind of those books have been the ones that have really kind of opened my eyes to some new ways of thinking about audience and the kind of non-neutrality of craft. I'm pausing because that could be enough, I imagine. But I'm also working on a creative nonfiction essay about for a year, about 15 years ago. I suffered from OCD, and it didn't look like what a lot of the kind of popular representations of OCD looked like. Like I wasn't, incredibly fastidious. I didn't have, sort of concerns around cleanliness and stuff. It was very different than that. And I think it's very misunderstood. And I thought I would try my hand at creative nonfiction for the first time. So an essay about that year and what I did to recover from it. So that's pretty close to my heart. I hope to find a place for that. And I'm also working on a story draft at the moment that there was an office tower in Venezuela some years ago that was taken over by displaced people. And they formed a community there, and in some ways worked with, and in some ways were at odds with the government. And for a long time, I've wanted to write a story about that happening. I couldn't place it in somewhere like Venezuela because the research required, I don't speak the language. Like there's just 100 reasons not to do that. But I had lived in Boston, and there is a significant homeless population in Boston, and there's there was an office tower that's considered to be built, and with the right kind of sequence of events, it wouldn't be impossible for something like that to happen. Particularly now, I think as we face, a looming eviction crisis, or perhaps in the midst of one related to COVID. So the story takes place basically now, and then a couple of years from now, with this community forming after a bunch of people in Boston experience evictions and decide to take over a building. And the main character is in a position where she's going to have to decide whether or not her more affluent partner can get her out of the tower and to have them kind of live a life that's safer, or whether or not she's going to sort of be in solidarity with her community there, as it becomes clear that the state government is probably going to raid them and try to throw them out.
I mean, that you kind of have projects in all areas going on with craft and fiction and creative nonfiction, and this new story. That this all sounds so fascinating. I'm so glad.
Yeah, I'm trying. I taught a class that in I taught a class in the spring, I think, that was creative writing studio, which was poetry and fiction and nonfiction. And I felt, kind of like, imposter syndrome. I felt kind of like a fraud teaching about creative nonfiction, because I hadn't really seriously done that. I mean, I'd done academic writing and stuff, but so part of that starting that essay about obsessive compulsive disorder was really to say, like, well, I better sit down and actually write something in this genre that I struggle with and revise and get to be the best thing I think it can be, and then send it out. That seemed, so if I'm called upon to teach that again, I don't feel like quite such a quite such an imposter.
Did that essay begin during that class that you were teaching, or did that come after?
Yeah. I mean, I had been reading a number of craft books about nonfiction, and just thinking to myself, what could I write about that would be an experience that not a lot of people have, or not a lot of people understand.
Right.
And that certainly was one of them.
Wow. So did anything, just out of curiosity, from writing the experience of writing the essay make its way into the classroom? Did you
not really. I mean, because we had to move so quickly, we and it was also we started the class in person and transitioned to Zoom.
Right.
Sort of right when all of this stuff was happening. It was my last semester. Last semester at Iowa, and then I taught another class in the summer while job searching, and then got my job out here and moved out here.
Thank you so much for telling me all of those different projects. They sound so fascinating and so important on so many levels. So I really appreciate your time telling me about them, and I appreciate your time being here with us tonight. This is where we're going to wrap up our Zoom space, and I just want to extend our gratitude again to you, Thomas, for reading and for talking with us. And I also want to extend thanks to the Missouri Review readers who might be watching this from different corners of their world. And this is just a reminder to let everyone know that this year's Jeffrey Smith Editors Prize is in full swing, and you can find out more details about the contest and how to submit to that contest on our website, which we will definitely link below. And we hope everyone has a wonderful, healthy, safe, and creative night. Thank you so much.